Good morning. So, a very good morning, everyone. Welcome to the annual conference. So perhaps let me start by introducing myself. I'm Jackline Wahba, and I'm a professor of economics at the University of Southampton, but I'm also the chair of the ERF Board of Trustees, and I have been a research fellow for a long time, and I'm really delighted this morning to actually be here and open this important annual conference on behalf of the Board of Trustees. So as I take a moment to reflect on the year behind us and the path that lies ahead, I'm reminded of what truly defines the Economic Research Forum. It's not just our track record, not just our data, not our conferences, our programs, it's our people, it's our network. In a time of growing uncertainty across economies, societies, and the environment, the value of the ERF network has never been more evident. This extraordinary community of researchers, partners, and thought leaders continues to be ERF's most powerful force for impact. In 2024, the Board of Trustees focused sharply on one priority: to ensure ERF's institutional and financial resilience. We knew this was essential, not only to preserve our mission, but to empower the network at the heart of our work. And ERF continued to deliver. From labor markets and social protection to climate change and inclusive growth, ERF's research this year tackled the region's most pressing challenges. With support from IDRC, we led a transformative program on the role of MSMEs in the clean energy transition, conducted cutting-edge work on climate macroeconomics, and mapped MENA's renewable energy supply chains. Our data efforts also made major strides. We successfully completed the Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey 2023, launched the Jordan Labor Market Survey for 2024, and continued to expand open access to high-quality microdata across the region. Just as importantly, we continued to communicate and connect. Our 30th annual conference in Rabat, Tragedies of Regional Conflicts and Promises of Peace Building, was a landmark event. It brought together over 500 participants, featured Nobel laureate Professor James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu, and explored how institutions can shape a more peaceful, prosperous future. We followed that with high-level policy dialogues in Dubai and Cairo, reinforcing ERF's unique role as a platform where evidence meets decision-making. But year after year, it's the network that sets ERFs apart. In 2024, we received over 240 research submissions for the annual conference. After a rigorous selection process, 66 outstanding papers will be presented across 22 sessions. This is more than academic achievement. It's a testament to the intellectual energy, credibility, and the depth of ERF's regional and global partnerships. Our researchers and collaborators continue to drive meaningful change. They bring fresh insights, they build data, they shape policy, and together they form a research environment that is dynamic, inclusive, and resilient. To our valued partners over the years for their continued supports, I thank the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, IDRC, the Ford Foundation, AFD, the World Bank, and many others. Very grateful. But in particular, I would like to thank IDRC, the Ford Foundation, and AFD for the support for this conference. To the Board of Trustees, thank you for your guidance. To our advisory committee, ERF management team, and staff, thank you for your tireless commitment. ERF's story is not just about 3 decades, it's about what comes next. And I'm confident that with this remarkable network and your support, we will meet the future challenges with purpose, clarity, and unity. And may 2025 be a year of collaboration, innovation, and impact, not just for ERF, but for our region. I'm looking forward to the next 3 days and to a very successful conference. So thank you for being here this morning. So we have a very interesting session and also very tight in terms of time. So I'm delighted to say that this first session is going to explore this relationship between human development, youth demographic dividends, and migration. And we will have 2 presentations, the first one by Paul Makdissi. So Paul Makdissi is a professor of economics at the Department of Economics, University of Ottawa, Canada. And he will be talking about youth and the desire of individuals of control over their lives and human development in the Arab region. And I will follow that by talking about migration and displacement and talking about the challenges and opportunities. And we also have 3 discussants, Professor Ragui Assaad, who is a professor and Freeman Chair for International Economic Policy, Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. Then we have Dr. Wessam Beih, Regional Director, Middle East and North Africa at IDRC. And we also have Clémence Vidal de la Blache, who is the Egypt Country Director at AFD, which is a French development agency. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Paul Makdissi.
You know, when you get an invitation like this, you always try to bring things back to the thing that you know. So this is what I would do. This is the kind of thing researcher we kind of do. So when my friend Ibrahim al-Badawi asked me if I could talk about the demographic dividend, and then I said, okay, let's find something that I know and bring this back to something that I know. The theme of the conference is about the demographic dividend, but in order to benefit from the demographic dividend, one needs to make sure that the young people want to stay in their country. In reality, in many Arab countries, there is a high desire to emigrate among Arab youth. Probably in the US, they have the same presently at the moment. So if we look at data from the last wave of the Arab Barometer, and we look at the question about the desire to emigrate, in the countries that were surveyed in that wave, 4 countries have more than 50% of their youth that express a desire to leave the country. So it's Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia. So in the talk today, and you know, we're in the Arab region. Unfortunately, Ragui didn't succeed yet to convince all these countries to run surveys. So we don't have enough data. So what I will be doing is playing with alternative data. It's not the right thing to do. We should work with household survey, but I have this philosophy: if you don't have household survey, let's talk and let's use other things to talk about what is happening. So what is immigration linked with? So it's often linked with a lack of human development opportunities. So my dear colleagues, Dibe, Fakih, and Marouche, have 2 papers on the desire of immigration for youth, and they find in their paper that labor market condition influence regular youth migration patterns, and both an institutional environment and the jointly influence both regular and irregular youth migration. So these findings, from my perspective, one of the author is here, so he can contradict me, shows the importance of enhancing human development beyond income alone to retain young people in the region. So in this talk, let's explore a little bit human development as I will define it in the next few slides. So if we take Amartya Sen's capability approach, Amartya Sen shifts the focus of social justice. So our human development is a concept of social justice from resources or utility to capabilities. So the capabilities are the real freedom that the people have to achieve the lives they value. So how they can use resources and the institutional environment to achieve some social functionings. So it's not something weird to use, because this idea underpins both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Arab Multidimensional Poverty Index that is produced by ESQA, which in the two cases emphasize multiple dimensions of well-being. So the key conceptual chain is you have goods and services. Then you use these goods and services in some institutional context, and it may affect the way you can use them to achieve some social functionings. And these social functionings produce utility. From a social justice point of view, if you take Amartya Sen's approach, utility doesn't matter. This is a matter of personal responsibility. Once you have achieved, you have a set of social functionings large enough among which you can choose. To assess how goods and services, education, health, income, are transformed into social functioning, it is crucial to collect detailed context-relevant statistical information. And one interesting example, and I'm sure I don't need to convince anybody in this room, and then don't say my employer that I talked about this. The Palestinian Authority in its national MPI includes safety and security, obstructed access to own assets, freedom of movement, and women's empowerment as information on how people can transform their goods and services into social functionings. You can have a land with olive trees, but if you cannot access it, you cannot use it. While the MPI focuses on the most deprived, some analysts would advocate to examine the entire joint distribution of attributes, and this is what we will do today. So we'll take a different approach. Of course, I'm bringing this back to something that I know. So Wagstaff introduced in 2002 an idea of a health achievement index. So in Wagstaff context, it's a bivariate context, so two dimensions. So income is one of the dimensions that produces socioeconomic ranks, and then health is another dimension. And the achievement index is constructed so it increases when the average health status increases, but it also increases if you reduce socioeconomic inequalities in its distribution. Mira Yazbek and I wrote a paper in 2016, and one of the referees using the Wagstaff context, and one of the referees was nice enough to ask us, yeah, but why are you using this? Can you justify this from a social welfare perspective? It's good, it's my field, so I was able to do it. So we argued in this paper that a health achievement index can be seen as a contribution of one of the dimensions to a multidimensional human development index. The way we do that, we just join together all different dimensions, and all these dimensions are linked by the socioeconomic ranks of the observation. And today I will use data from the Arab barometers, so I don't have a continuous, it's not true for 1 year I have, but many missing observation. I don't have enough observation of a continuous income variable. So what I do in this paper, I take an alternative approach and I borrow from another paper I co-wrote with Mohammed Khaled, Prasad Arao, and Mira Yazbek on multidimensional inequality. So we use the joint survival function to produce ranks. So I will use the data from the Arab Barometer. I use two waves, the 2018-19 and the 2023-24. I use 3 dimensions, not because it's the only dimensions that are important, but because it's the dimensions on which I have information: income, education, autonomy. So I use the entire distribution of these, and in the income variable, I'm using self-reported income sufficiency. This is not the best thing, but I'm using it. It has 4 categories. Education has number of years, and autonomy, I will explain in the next few slides, but I construct an index that takes value between 0 and 1 based on the index they have in the word value survey. So why autonomy? Autonomy is has been pointed in a UNESCO 2018 Social Development Report. And when I read it, I said, oh my God, this is an important dimension. So in the index that I will use, I would use social ranks, the social weights on socioeconomic ranks, that is the Gini weights. And then, of course, I will put the weights aside and look at the robustness of the results. Why autonomy is important? So autonomy expands the life choices beyond income and education. So let me take this example that I'm sure that many of you can understand. So assume that we have an observation, a woman that doesn't have a job. It's different if this woman doesn't have a job because of social pressure that is refraining her for looking for a job, or if the woman doesn't have a job because she doesn't want to have a job. These are 2 different things. Same outcome, 2 different things. So of course, in the later case, in the last case, the capabilities, the set of available social functionings are wider. So here I'm just using this example, but expand this to many other ideas. So the construction of our autonomy index is similar to Welzel Emancipative Value Index included in the Word Value Survey. I use 7 questions from the Arab Barometers, capturing views on religion, public life, gender roles, and democratic values. And I produce, and here I will make my point. Here I'm producing a human development index, putting all these things together. Doesn't say that much. Produces a number. From a policy perspective, what should I do? I don't know. Okay, the index has changed its value. So here we can see here that, of course, in Lebanon, there is a reduction in human development between 2018 and 2024. 5 minutes, okay. But what I want to do is, okay, let's look dimension by dimension. We'll only look at 1 dimension because I have 5 minutes. So if we look at the dimensions of autonomy, so we can see the rankings don't change that much. There is a reduction in autonomy in Morocco from the achievement index that we produce. What explains the ranking of the countries? In terms of Lebanon doesn't do good in terms of human development, mainly for the income dimension. For autonomy, among the 4, it does better. Why? Because it has a long-standing tradition of diverse value system. Tunisia ranks 2nd. It's not a surprise. They have a history of civic education and support for women's rights. Then comes Jordan, and then at last comes Morocco. So probably with the decrease in autonomy in Morocco between the 2 years, it's probably a resurgence of social conservatism. And the last thing that I want to say, it's typically, I use here to construct the index and get the result, a specific social weight function. Are these results robust to the social weight function? So we use absolute concentration curve. When these curves do not intersect, you could infer that for any social wealth weight function that you would impose on the index, you will get the same result. And in terms of autonomy, the ranking of the 4 countries is robust to that. A last thing that I want to do is to to say that autonomy is a resource-free lever. You can change human development by increasing autonomy without increasing that much resources. So let's do a counterfactual analysis to look where is hidden this autonomy within society. So typically, in many countries, it will be among university graduates, those who are more educated. In the Esquire report, they say it's more among the youth in the Arab countries. And I do an additional exercise. So let's produce a counterfactual scenario if men change their view and have exactly the same autonomy of women, the same return to characteristics than women in each one of the countries. And I use an approach that we produced in another paper. So here, if everybody in each one of the society would have the same return than university graduates to other demographic characteristics, doesn't change that much. A bit on top socioeconomic rank in Jordan and Lebanon. In Morocco, doesn't change anything. In Tunisia, it will drive autonomy up. If everybody had the same return than citizen below 30, then everybody has the same return to demographic characteristics than the youth, doesn't change that much. A bit in Tunisia. The secret is hidden there. In all 4 countries, if men had the same return to demographic characteristics than women, then autonomy, and autonomy is what? It's expanding the choices of people with the same resources will be wider. So the secret is there. Put women in power. These individuals are the drivers of social change, and this is where it is hidden. Yeah. So the education divide, a little bit, the age divide only in Tunisia, and the gender divide. But if everybody has the same return than women, it would have positive effect in all 4 countries. And thank you very much for your attention.
So when I was asked about a year ago, which actually shows how long the preparation for this conference takes by the ERF management to talk about migration and displacement, I was very honored and I was very delighted. I have been working on migration for a very long time. And initially, I started exploring migration within the region. And more recently, I have been looking at migration outside of the region and also the perspective of host countries outside of the region. So what I hope to do today is to give you a very quick overview of some of the issues, basically starting from where Paul has finished, thinking about migration in the region, thinking about the demographic dividend, and whether actually this is a burden or not, what is the role of human capital, labor markets in particular, and then talk about one very important issue for our region, which is forced migration, and thinking about the labor market again, human capital, thinking about interventions, and then some policy options. So I hope I will be able to do all of that in 20 minutes. So migration has been really important for our region, but I'm going to start with the bottom line. The bottom line is that we have very bad data on migration. So if we wanted to, if you ask me today, what are, the sort of trends, how many Egyptian migrants are abroad, I will tell you, if you look at the data, it actually ranges from around 3-4 million by UNDES, which is the United Nations. Or if you look at what has been published in, newspapers, on behalf of the Minister of Immigration, it might be 14 million. And CAPMES also published a figure of 10 million. So in case of Egypt, this is the case. In case of other countries, we might not have any figures at all. Morocco is a similar case. So there is a huge, variation in terms of the official numbers, about maybe 5 million. We know that this is an underestimate. But even if it is 5 million, this is like 15%. If we want to understand better the role of migration, we need to look at remittances. And remittances are really important because for countries like Egypt, one of the top sort of receiving countries in terms of remittances globally, it's ranked 5th. For Morocco, in terms of, as in Jordan and Tunisia, as you can see in the bottom sort of, figure, as a percentage of GDP, remittances really are important. But there is a huge distinction between when we are looking at origin countries, labor exporting countries. The trends we see in the MENA region are very different because some countries are basically involved in temporary migration, like Egypt and Jordan, because mainly migration is to the Gulf states. While if we look at North Africa, especially the Maghreb countries, they are involved mainly in permanent migration to Europe, with a very small proportion to other Arab countries or countries in the MENA region. So let me first start to think a little bit about what is this relationship between human capital, labor markets, and immigration, and try to answer the question whether youth demographic is actually a dividend or a burden. And here, if we look at some of the very recent statistics using Egypt labor market panel survey, we actually find evidence that unemployment and underemployment are important push factors. So 40% of current migrants were unemployed before migrating. 43% of those who were employed in irregular work. And if we also look at push factors, lack of job opportunities was seen as a main reason. And if we also try to think about, the opposite side, so many of those people who have migrated were unemployed. And the question here is migration bad or actually helping? Is it releasing pressure on the labor market of origin or not? But the relationship is actually very complex. And what is also important to realize that one of the most important pull factor is the labor market and higher income in destinations. So again, when we look at those intending to migrate in Egypt, we actually find that more than half of them sort of, state that higher income is a main reason. So there is no doubt whatsoever that the labor market is a very important driver of emigration. When it comes to human capital, we know a number of facts, huge evidence by many scholars that more educated people are more likely to migrate. We also know that when people aspire to migrate or intend or plan to migrate, they invest more in education. And this is what is called in this literature a brain gain. So not everybody migrate, and therefore, there is an increase in educational level in the origin. But we also know that remittances, as I have just shown you, how important it is typically invested in human capital. So more education for children and also health to some extent. However, when we look at the figures, and I have to say that, this table here is based on the World Bank, bilateral migration data for 2020. Have to take it with a pinch of salt. Those are estimates. So basically, if you're looking at the high-skilled immigration rate, which would give us a sort of an indication of what one would call a brain drain, you can see that, the percentage of high-skilled migrating is very high. In some countries in particular, like Jordan, is excessively high. But I put, again, this question, whether this is, problematic and to what extent it is problematic. Because we know that in many cases, those who migrate, especially within the region, they return. And return migration is really important because those who migrate temporarily and then return, they return with, overseas savings, of course, but they also return with skills. And those skills are human capital accumulation. Those skills are basically seen in an increase in entrepreneurship. So there are several papers looking at entrepreneurship among returnees for Egypt, for Tunisia, for Morocco, for Turkey as well. Huge number of papers documenting that. And there are also a very small literature showing how returnees acquire more skills, and when they return, they actually have higher wages. So they have a wage premium compared to people who did not migrate in Egypt, and they also move up the occupational ladder as well. So this is evidence of brain gain as opposed to brain drain. So then I come to the next question, which I think is a question really important for many countries, because all of a sudden, many of the countries in the region who were basically labor exporting countries have become host to displaced and forced migrants. And this has really changed the narrative, because this basically all of a sudden, those countries who were sending millions, such as Egypt, now are hosting millions. And the question is, what is the impact of that on the labor market? So displacement, and I'm going to be very quickly here, globally is a real problem. And when we're talking about displacement, 123 million are displaced globally. Many of them are internally displaced, as in the case, for example, of Sudan and Syria. And we also see that, especially when we look at the region is responsible for many of those displaced globally. Again, those are official registered numbers, so those do not include unregistered refugees, for example. But for Syria in particular, so in 2025, the numbers were around 6.2 million were living abroad, huge sort of number. And many of them are hosted by the region. Turkey is hosting over 3 million, and we also have many who are internally displaced. At the same time, Sudan has had a huge conflict. Many Sudanese are displaced internally, and around 3 million or so, 3.8 million are actually displaced in African countries, and some of them in Egypt as well. So when we look globally, and before the Ukraine war, Syria used to be the top one. Now we can see that Syria is still the country of origin globally, right, responsible for most number of refugees, followed by Ukraine. But as you can see, South Sudan and Sudan also appear here. And at the same time, our countries in the region are the main host globally. So we have Iran, Turkey, and if you actually look at number of refugees per 1,000 people, we immediately find that some countries are actually bearing the brunt of hosting more than they can, basically sustain in a way. So Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey are the top of the global sort of destinations when we're looking at the percentage in terms of population. So this raises a very important set of questions. And the next few slides are basically trying to bring together a number of my papers on this area and trying to distill what we have learned. So looking at the effects of displacement on hosting labor markets, there is a huge literature, I have to say, on this. I focus on the case of Jordan in particular, and focusing on a particular point in time. Jordan in 2015 had around 1.3 million Syrians, 1.6 million non-Jordanians, and the population was around 6.6 million. There was a Jordan Compact allowing, Syrians to work. And the question we ask here in that paper was, to what extent this Syrian refugees influx, which is huge, right, relative to the population, what was the impact on Jordanians? What was the impact on the natives, right, labor market outcomes? So first, and very quickly, when we look at, where do Jordanians, Syrians, and other nationals sort of work in terms of sector and in terms of type of employment, one thing we see clearly in Jordan and in other countries like Turkey and other, host countries, refugees tend to work in the informal sector. Natives or nationals, Jordanians in this case, tend to work in the public sector. So there is a sort of a segmentation there. So we basically looked at the geographical distribution of refugees, and we tried to find out whether there has been an adverse effects or not. And we actually did not find a negative impact of the influx of Syrians on the Jordanian labor market. And of course, at first, this was a big surprise. You have 1.3 million. How can this be? And basically, there are three main reasons here. Most of the Syrians were women and children who were not participating in the labor market. Of course, what we forget is that when you have an influx of people, they also increase demand. So demand increase, and therefore demand for jobs increase as well. And more importantly, and this is something I would like to come back to, there was an increase in foreign aid to actually assist and help with hosting the refugees, as well as increase in trade. So although there was changes in the labor market and higher unemployment, during that period, it actually goes back to before the influx, and the financial support of international donors here was very important. We also looked at a very simple question: is what happens to nationals when you have influx of refugees? And we were looking at the residential mobility, we were looking at their job location and commuting, again, in the case of Jordan. And what we found, surprisingly, is that most Jordanians, if we look at mobility, we found some evidence that some of them actually moved out of camp governorates because of higher rents and competition in schools. But surprisingly, they actually, for job purposes, they moved into camp governorates, and therefore commuting increased. So in other words, they tried to move out of areas where Syrians were living, but in terms of jobs, they were going to those same areas. Surprisingly, we didn't find any evidence on the impact of refugees on international or return migration. One final thing we also looked at, we thought that perhaps there is no impact on nationals, but what we actually found that there is an impact on other immigrants. Many of those immigrants were actually Egyptians who were working in Jordan, and we found that there was a huge competition between Syrians and other immigrants. So basically this had a negative impact on other immigrants, especially in terms of fewer hours and lower wages. And this was mainly because of the lower educated immigrants. And this raises a very important issue about focusing on immigrants' welfare as much as the welfare of other groups. Very quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, one of the things which I wanted to show you is basically destination choice. So this paper, I was looking at within the EU, where were people going? And this was going back to a very simple question: to what extent the labor market in European countries or the welfare system is actually attracting refugees. So to give you an example, in 2015-2016, more than 1 million Syrian refugees went to Germany. A lot of actually refugees in the EU came from Syria during that period. And there are huge policy questions whether they're attracted by welfare system or by the success of their applications. And we basically found that the most important factor is networks, social networks. So if we wanted to explain the destination of where refugees and asylum seekers went, we actually found that networks really matter, but unemployment was the third important factor. Whether unemployment in the destination really provided another incentive for refugees to move to certain destination. Then we also looked at a very important sort of aspect related to human capital. And here, we have a number of papers which are trying to think about integration of children, because when refugees actually move, I think children bear the brunt of the trauma. And looking at the case of Turkey, there are a number of interventions which actually matter. So teachers training was one example whereby providing teachers training regarding the refugees' trauma and how to deal with them actually increased the Syrian children's integration in the educational system, reduced their absenteeism, as well as language training for Syrian children in Turkey. Again, the language training program was very successful. And we also looked at a different sort of aspect, which is a very controversial issue. Some countries decide to have extra classes, separate classes for refugees. And our work here was trying to show that actually, if you want children to integrate, you want to actually mix children in classes with natives, and a sort of 25%, sort of refugees to natives is the sort of figure we find. So, having rushed through all of that, I want to spend a couple of minutes on the conclusion and policy implications. One very important issue is that in many labor exporting countries, we don't have migration policy. And what is needed is to think of what I call a win-win-win migration policy. How can the origin, the host, and the migrant win? Because in many cases, the policies we have actually do not help. One very important issue as well is collecting better data. Better data about immigration, but also better data about immigrants and refugees, foreign population, as well as return migration. One very important barrier for individuals and migrants from the region, especially those who go to Europe and to North America, in terms of being able to utilize their qualifications, is the lack of qualification recognition. And there are also sort of discussions about skill partnership, investing in skills, in origin countries, and then allowing sort of temporary migration. One other important issue, and you would probably be surprised when you looked at the figure, is that despite the flows of official remittances, the transfer cost is still pretty high. And in many cases, sometimes the migrant has to spend 5% of every $100 they actually send home just to transfer the money. And exchange rate policies, in many cases, in the case of Egypt in particular, we know during the last 2 or 3 years, have actually worked against, migrants sending remittances officially. Excuse me. And finally, one very important policy implication, and I raise this at a time where I know that what is happening in the West, in North America, in the UK, is actually cutting foreign aid. And here, this is a plea, because without humanitarian aid to help countries to host refugees, those countries will suffer. So we only see, what happened in Jordan and not having a negative impact on the labor market because of the foreign aid. So at a time when foreign aid is actually being cut, this raises a very big concern about how those host countries in the region are going to be able to, host this influx of refugees. Thank you. So I give the floor to Ragui for the first discussion.
Great. Well, this really has been a very interesting set of interventions, and I want to think about this nexus between youth, demographic dividend, and migration in the context of what Paul and Jackie just presented. And so the 3 questions I want to address are do we still have a youth demographic crisis in the region? Because we hear a lot about that, and people are, are the data showing otherwise? Is youth migration a problem or part of the solution? So again, thinking about migration as a dividend or a burden. And then, does forced migration necessarily hurt host countries? This is, again, another very important part of the policy debate, where we're hearing a lot more about the costs of that migration imposes on hosts. So first, the issue about the youth bulge. Now, the youth bulge is basically the increase in the share of the population of youth, share of population of youth in the total population. And this has happened, but the peak for that share is pretty much behind us. This happened in most of the regions, some countries in the 80s and 90s, but in most of the regions in the early 2000s. So it's been 20 years since that peak share happened, and only in a few countries like Yemen, Sudan, and Syria is the youth bulge, or the peak has been fairly recent in time. But what about since then? What happened to that share? That share dropped quite dramatically in many countries. In Iran, for example, it dropped by almost 48%, but on average, it dropped around 17, 18%. So 1/5 decline in the share of youth in the population. So the crisis is significantly abated compared to its peak, and often public perceptions about what's happening demographically lag what's really happening by about 10, 20 years. And I think that, so there is, but there is another side to the story, which is the echo. And the echo is the children of those youth bulge generations. The youth bulge generation is now old enough to have its own children, and these children are now entering their youth years, or will soon be entering their youth years. And they will start putting, this is a smaller bulge, it's an echo of the original, and it tends to put pressure on education systems first, and then next on labor markets. And you can see here that the next peak, or the smaller peak, is going to occur in the region around the mid-2030s, 2033 for North Africa in general, Egypt 2032. In a few countries, it's going to be a lot earlier, and only in the countries that had a very late demographic transition like Syria and Yemen is it going to occur in the 40s. So we're going to have another upcoming shorter period of demographic pressure, which is coming up pretty soon in the next decade. But beyond that, the youth percentage in the population will decline quite rapidly. So that's the youth demographics. Now, what about the dividend? And, there were two presentations talked about the dividend, but more tangentially. Paul assumed that the dividend exists. If the youth don't leave, we will reap the dividend from the population age structure. However, realizing that dividend depends on being able to make use of these human resources. So it's an opportunity. It becomes a dividend only if you're able to have complementary conditions to take advantage of the age structure of the populations. And we know that for many reasons in this region, from geopolitical instability to climate change-induced droughts to bad governance, civil wars, these opportunities are unlikely to be realized in most MENA countries. We really don't have the complementary conditions to make use of that youthful population. And so under such conditions, I would argue that, as Jackie said, migration then is not such a bad option to relieve pressures on the labor market, and especially if if it involves substantial remittances coming back, and if it's temporary in nature, where these people can bring some of these skills back and the human capital back. And so the nature of migration and how it's regulated, I think, makes a very important difference in whether it can be a win-win-win or it can be a burden taking human resources away from a country. So both speakers addressed the issue of migration from a normative perspective. I think Paul basically assumes that it's a bad development outcome for youth to migrate or to want to migrate, and it prevents the realization of the demographic dividend, and it's linked to a lack of human development opportunities, which I agree with. But given that we have bad human development opportunities, maybe having migration is a good out. Jackie takes a more nuanced view, but is mostly positive about her view of migration, normative view. It relieves the pressure on the labor market, as she said. It produces valuable remittances. There is the risk of brain drain, but is also brain gain, and so it could work on both sides in terms of human capital development. And if you have the right policy mix, you can maximize brain gain, reduce brain drain, and you can even have these win-win-win outcomes. So the question is how you really manage it. Now, I thought Paul provided us with a very valuable framework for constructing a multidimensional human development index. As he said, the existing multidimensional poverty indices, for example, are focused primarily on deprivation, whereas we are interested in the entire distribution of these outcomes. And so Paul's index is really innovative way of looking at how the entire distribution matters, and also who gets the human development within the distribution matters. Now, he focuses on this autonomy dimension, which is a really innovative part of his paper, and it's inspired by Friend's work on Amartya Sen's work on development as freedom. You want to expand the development opportunity set for people. It's not just what they're able to do, but it's what they can choose to do. And it also has the advantage of, if you expand freedoms, you don't always have to expand resources. Material resources can be fixed and limited, but you can expand freedoms and people can get more well-being out of those resources. However, I think the choice of components within the autonomy index is very important. And some people could argue that they reflect cultural biases and maybe a Western orientation of what is autonomy. And I think one has to kind of be careful about how one chooses the components of that autonomy index. But I think the last point Paul makes in his presentation is that gender responsive policies are good because they expand autonomy, and therefore they may reduce emigration. I think that speculation is a bit too much of a step to make unless you show evidence for it. Migration is primarily involving men in this region who leave, and expanding gender autonomy, I don't know if necessarily is going to prevent these men from wanting to leave. So I think that the empirical link needs to be examined a little bit. Now I come back to this issue of brain drain that Jackie raised. And she did show us very convincingly that a lot of migrant labor is not fully utilized prior to migration. So that's prima facie evidence that against the brain drain hypothesis, there is an excess of some of these resources. But she also showed us that more educated are much more likely to migrate, and there's higher rates of migration among them. And that one cannot exclude the fact that in certain segments of the labor market, specialized segments, for instance, in Egypt, health and medicine is an area where a lot of doctors are leaving, potentially putting pressure on the ability to deliver services. In the IT sector as well, there's a lot of attraction to people to leave that sector. So I think brain drain is an issue for certain segments of the labor market, but as a general rule, it is not a huge problem. I would say the arguments about brain gain that Jackie gave us are actually quite convincing. The investing in education prior to migration, in anticipation of migration, the fact that, and that kind of suggests that efforts to recognize qualifications internationally so that people can go to the host labor market and say, I have these qualifications, and is definitely very important to encourage regular migration as opposed to irregular migration. And also the remittances themselves, while people are abroad, are increasing human capital among their families as they're invested in human capital at home. And then return migration. If we can get the migrants to return, which means if they, and the difference is that in Europe, they don't return because they cannot guarantee that they can come back to. And so if you allow them these circular migration, if they can migrate legally and be able to return, then you have a lot of benefits from return migration in terms of entrepreneurship, valuable experiences, and upward occupational mobility, which Jackie very well documented. Okay. And forced migration, I think Jackie showed that there are very good arguments that all the negative consequences of forced migration that have been worried about are not supported in many cases. The case of Jordan, that has a very large proportion of its population in the form of refugees, not having these huge impacts is convincing that in countries where the proportion is smaller, like Egypt, for example, that the impacts would be even lesser. There were we found other research besides Jackie's showed that there were no effects on educational outcomes of Jordanians. So there is a trade-off between benefits to the Syrians of being mixed in, but potential harm to the Jordanians if they had a lot of Syrians in their classroom. And then finally, the issue of housing. Housing was the one area where we found that Jordanians were negatively affected by the presence of the Syrians. So, and I think the evidence that the refugees are not just flowing to countries that have more generous welfare benefits or where there are employment, whether employment bans matter or not, most of the evidence shows that it's about networks and it's about the state of the economy, their ability to get jobs in the... So the main takeaways for me is migration can be a way to realize a demographic dividend. If you think about the demographic dividend as being about the people of a country and not just the country, the geographic boundaries of the country. And it also, however, it has to be managed for that win-win-win outcome that Jackie talked about. So migration, you can think about it as a global public good that requires public action to manage and to be able to maximize its benefits. Otherwise, you can get some negative outcomes resulting. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to move to our next discussant, Dr. Wessam Beih.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ragui. And very happy to be here with you all today. I guess I don't have slides, but I have a few questions that I was thinking about since the invitation of ERF came with this very important topic. So my points will circle around three main interventions. One, around the context of how we're talking about youth and migration. And second is the different perspective of youth, migrants, be it voluntary migration or forced migration. And the third, since I represent a research for development organization, is the role of research. And are we communicating what we know? And are we communicating about what we don't know? And how are we using it to inform policies? So I guess my first point about the context is that we are now seeing a new formation, let's say, of the global context that we're operating in. We cannot discuss youth and migration in absence of acknowledging that global challenge, a challenge with regards to changes in international funding policies, a challenge with regards to conflict that is arising in so many different parts of our world, and of course, a changes with regards to the economic instability that is not just a characteristic of the MENA region that forces young people to leave, but it's also changing all over the world. There are less jobs, There are post-COVID era where people are also changing in terms of the opportunities that are available for them. So all this has to be taken into consideration as we also discuss what drives young people to move from one country to another. On the second point, with regards to migration, I feel that there is a lot of perception gap with regards to how young people are also looking at how they're feeling, how they're experiencing. So let's talk at the very beginning about voluntary migration, when people choose to leave, and as we saw from the presentations, that economic challenges in their home country is one of the reasons that people are leaving their home countries and in search for a better kind of economic opportunities, growth, and so on. The educated leave, and also the unskilled workers leave. With this huge population of more than 60% below 30 years old, the limited access to quality education, healthcare, are concerns in their home countries. But are policymakers addressing the root causes of why people leave or not? And are they making the right policies or not? And as young people leave in search of new and better economic opportunities, do they still feel that those new economic opportunities that they may secure is giving them also the same quality of life that they aspired for? We are seeing in a lot of parts of the world now a lot more discrimination, particularly for young people that are originating from this region. We are also seeing a lot of difficulty to integrate in host countries. Unskilled workers is another story, because unskilled workers are also subject to not just discrimination, but also exploitation, precarious living conditions in the countries that they migrate to. Are those perspectives of young people taken into consideration? And do we inform enough the policies that enable better integration services? For example, that example that Jackie gave about Turkey and the approaches it has taken in order to integrate better migrants. Is this something that is announced and communicated to policymakers? If we talk about forced migration and people who are leaving their home countries because of the conflict that it's experiencing or because of fear for their lives, this is a completely different story. And we are seeing a lot more hostility in host countries. The perspective that has been shared about how refugees are not impacting the labor market, policymakers might have a different perspective. They might be looking at the burden on the social services that they have to provide for those additional refugees that are in the country. And also, we're not communicating enough the added value of bringing in additional skills and expertise to fill labor shortages, enrich cultural diversity, and can build more inclusive societies. On my last point with regards to policy making, are policies enabling youth to return to their home countries? So even if there is gain of expertise when they have immigrated and they would like to come back to their home countries, will they come back and actually find an enabling environment that helps them to integrate well or not? What are those policies like, and how should they be informed? How can entrepreneurs come and find an investment opportunity that does not drive them again away? Do policymakers know what is the value of refugees, when they are hosted in their countries? What kind of skills that they bring? What is the burden and what is the counter argument of that? I think there is a huge gap between research and policymakers. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention is some of examples that could actually make this gap a little bit less. We heard as part of both presentations that there is bad data, that there is gaps in knowledge, So there are unknowns that we don't really know, and if research community does not know them, the chances for policymakers to actually make informed policies that suit young people actually work or not. Some of the examples that I wanted to share from IDRC's work to try to make this gap a bit shorter between research and policy making is an example of the Arab Youth Policy Research Initiative. And this is really trying to set up a regional hub to stimulate research and offer solutions that are accepted by youth, to give youth a voice in order to have conversations with policymakers, how to promote informed policies that take into account youth perspectives, and also to ensure that the impact of those policies are well received by young people. Another example is looking holistically at the African continent and all the investments that IDRC has made in previous years for youth-developed projects, working more with youth-led organizations to do a comprehensive meta-analysis of all the projects that took into consideration the expressions of youth, their needs, how to break the cycle of physical, symbolic, and systemic violence that might affect new policies in the future. And the last one that looks at the future of work, that looks at the gaps and the skills of young people, with a regional hub for the Middle East and North Africa that looks at the transition on women and youth and marginalized groups in particular in the MENA region, how to look at the skill gaps, the imbalances in the labor market that might offer new opportunities for future generation to find good opportunities in their host countries. And the last one that I wanted to mention is maybe looking specifically at fragile context in particular, looking at how to improve access to education, mental health services for displaced youth, particularly who are not able to move outside of the region, but how to ensure that they have continuing opportunities as they go. We cannot quantify maybe at this point in time the expression of hope for the future. But in terms of a general sense, if young people are able to have hope for the future, maybe the dynamics of migration will also change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last intervention is by Clémence.
Everyone, thank you for my fellow panelists. It's a very difficult task for me this morning. One, because as the introduction made clear, I'm the only panelist without a PhD. And the second, obviously, is I'm the last discussant, and it's very difficult to add to the masterful commentaries by Ragui and Wessam. So I'll try to keep it very simple, also on 3 points. The first one is, why should a development partner, a development finance institution like AFD, the French Development Agency, care? I think the panel conversation clearly showed why we should care, but how should we engage around this complex and nuanced question of the nexus, to take Ragui's term, between demographic dividend, migration? 2, how do we very modestly contribute to try to answer the data question? How do we engage with actors like ERF to contribute to evidence-based policy and financing responses in what is increasingly a politically fraught conversation as well? And 3, try to illustrate through a couple of examples in AFD's Egypt portfolio how we contribute and mainstream migration in some of our development finance operations. So to start with and to frame the question, I think Wessam, you powerfully reminded us of the context in which this conversation is happening. Maybe if I try to summarize 2 key take-homes for me from the keynotes. One, obviously, youth immigration as a response to a lack of human development opportunities. That was the key phrase for me from Dr. Paul's presentation. Becoming a necessity rather than an aspiration for many young people on account of a feeling of a lack of autonomy, a lack of purpose, a lack of opportunity, of income security. But I think, Jackie, you also showed the complex relationship between migration and development through the two key channels of the labor market and remittances, and then that additional layer of what happens when a country traditionally sending migrants, like Egypt, also becomes a host for forced migration or displacement. So for me, the inference for development partners like AFD is clearly that when we're designing strategies, when we're designing projects, when we're designing programs with our government counterparts, we need to be anchoring these questions around our interventions. We need to be centering development finance around youth, around gender, around decent jobs as drivers of growth. And we probably have a margin of improvement in that regard. AFD has a long history of involvement in youth and migration, both in research and operations, a mandate to act to make migration a factor, an opportunity in the development of the territories and with the partners that we work with, while also combating the causes of migration. But I really see quite a room for us to grow. Coming to my second point, I think, again, a key take-home for me on the panel this morning is how very bad the data is. I think that was your quote, Jackline. It's critical, obviously, to have reliable data as a base for evidence-based policies. It's difficult to get it right. So again, a couple of ways that AFD is trying to contribute to this objective. We support data collection through the OECD database on immigrants in OECD country. We've opened up our migration portfolio to external scrutiny. So we had a third-party evaluation of all of our migration operations from 2016 to 2021. And that's a paper that's online and that's available to kind of being unpicked by research networks. And then more specifically in Egypt, we've supported 2 waves of the Egyptian labor market panel survey with the ERF in 2018 and 2023. So it's also important for me to give a shout out to that collaboration. And that has given rise to research papers on migration and labor markets, and I wanted to acknowledge the work that was done between my colleagues from the research department and you, Jackie. I think maybe the key take-home, and you alluded to it in your presentation, of the paper that was co-written by Rawan, who's in the room, Anda, David, and yourself, is that if you compare the 2 exercises, so 2018 and 2023, in Egypt, what the data is showing us is higher immigration rates, lower return migration compared to 2018. And as the panel discussed this morning, this question of return migration is really critical to kind of capitalize on some of the gains. So that's a really important and preoccupying trend, but also a change in the profile of migrants. Those that are leaving are younger, they're more precarious. As you mentioned, they were unemployed before leaving, and they're less educated than before. And so, again, in terms of, from a development bank point of view, when it's confirmed that, and kind of echoing Dr. Paul's presentation, that challenging living conditions, lack of job opportunities were big push factors behind migration intentions. But also in terms of the type of projects that we're financing here in Egypt, it calls for maybe different policies than would have been implemented if the profile of immigrants were, to be a bit stereotypical, Egyptian doctors leaving for the UK, right? So when you have profile of immigrants which are more high-skilled, more educated, you don't have the same kind of policy intervention. And so that leads me to my third point, which is concretely what are we, what is a development partner, what is a development finance institutions like AFD doing in Egypt around this question? Three examples. One is at the national level, at the program level. For example, we've been financing since 2019 the rollout of the universal health insurance, UHIS. We're not yet at a stage where we have strong results in terms of impact assessment in Egypt, but we know from other countries in which we support these kind of reforms, for example in Cambodia, for example in Ethiopia, that they're very, very powerful social safety nets. And so contributing to this, structuring policy which is overhauling access and quality of healthcare, but also hopefully that's and we're working with the Egyptian government on setting up impact assessments to document that, hopefully also limiting households' catastrophic expenses related to healthcare. That's contributing, to limiting some of the push factors. At a program level, we have a big focus here in Egypt on entrepreneurship, with priorities on women-led and women-owned businesses. And I took your point, Ragui, on whether the gender interventions have all the potential or not. I think it's an interesting conversation, but that's a policy choice that we made a few years ago with very strong results already. We're working with MENA, which is the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency. And what's interesting, and when you invest in women business leaders, you have 20,000 women supported through MENA and 45,000 jobs created. So the ripple effect it goes way beyond the women entrepreneurs that are financed. We're also exploring vocational training. We didn't discuss that too much on the panel, but how investing in skill sets which are opportunities not only in the higher education space, but on vocational training can be a way to contribute. And then my last example is making sure there are sufficient resources in place to support refugee and host economies in the case of forced migration. So that's speaking to the last part of your presentation. We're currently working with the EU and with Egypt to mainstream migration in some of our health and education programs. We know that host communities in Egypt are mostly concentrated in 5 governorates, in Greater Cairo, Alexandria, Damietta, and so kind of both in terms of the choice of kind of spatial targeting of these programs, but also in the way that we design them, we're trying to build in this migration angle. And so, for example, one of the areas where I think we have a blind spot, listening to you this morning, Jackline, is on the teachers training, for example. It's something we haven't, we're designing the program as this year, and we haven't discussed it at all, and I think we need to hear from the research. So I'll conclude by saying that in the future, AFD will continue to prioritize investments in human development. This is true in Egypt. It's really a kind of red thread of our portfolio across the MENA region in education, vocational training, decent employment. We'll continue to attach great importance to integrating migration-related issues, including by being aware and addressing the specific vulnerabilities that are associated with forced migration. I think that's coming from both a political ask from the French government, which is our main shareholder, but also the partner governments that we work with. And the third point is to continuing to build the research partnerships across the region, and I think you spoke to the importance of that. We see a lot of value in it as well.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to close? Okay. So because of time, I would really like to thank everybody who's been on this panel, but let me try to just summarize what we have heard. So migration is a big challenge for the region, especially forced migration and in terms of policy. And I take the point about the gap between research and policy, And I also see that there is a great potential for more partnership between, development agencies and researchers to actually have a more rigorous impact assessment and the right policies. So I hope over the next 3 days we would be able to actually discuss all of those issues. And please, if you have questions for us, grab us during coffee and throughout the 3 days. And I look forward to a very productive and successful 3 days conference. Thank you very much.